Very good afternoon to all of you. Those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Adnan Trakic. I'm head of Business Law and Taxation Department in Monash University, Malaysia. My apologies, I wished I could have joined you earlier. I wasn't able to, so today is my first day to meet you all, and hopefully later on we can get to know each other better. I've been working very closely with Steve and Jennifer. We also have a CLARS hub in Malaysia, and I can just say, we are extremely happy to have you all with us here. So just want to make sure we start on time. My job today is to chair the session, to keep up the time, make sure we all do what we are supposed to do within the time given. We are in the session 3. Session 3 is on securities, regulations, and climate change. And the presenter is Professor Virginia Harper. So I'm told everyone knows everyone. I don't need to read out the biography of Prof. Virginia. So Prof. Virginia is a professor of law at the CTU School of Law. Virginia, the floor is yours. Please, welcome.
Thanks. Is this on? I guess it is. All right. Thanks very much. This is, unlike many of the wonderful papers and projects that we've heard about thus far, is not a work in progress. It's a book chapter. It's coming out soon, I think, in an edited volume by Doug Kysar at Yale and Ernest at NUS that's looking at private law and climate change, but oddly enough includes securities law in the mix. I recognize this is a corporate law forum, but I think there's kind of 3 intersections with our work here today. One is that we've been exploring this theme of geopolitics and how does geopolitics matter. This is actually a US-centric project originally, in which case the combination of securities regulation and climate change in the same sentence is by itself kind of has political valence. So that's one intersection with our theme. The other is that when writing this book chapter about, it really goes to the question we've been puzzling over for several days, which is what difference does law make? Now, in my case, my assignment was to write on securities regulation. So the issue was, what difference does securities regulation make to climate change in the real world? But also, what effect has climate had on the field, these fields of law? And so, there was a kind of why does law matter sort of question in the background of this project. And then the third thing is there is a corporate governance intersection, because obviously capital markets regulation has an effect on corporate governance, which is something I'm very interested in. And part of the US context has been a kind of recent attack, actually, by the Trump administration's SEC on the mechanisms of shareholder influence in public companies, and that kind of plays into the story of what difference can securities regulation make. But what I would like to do is first of all, kind of just start with my punchline on the assignment I was given for this book chapter, which is to say that obviously climate, ESG, these topics have entered into capital market regulation. So in that sense, climate change has mattered to securities regulation, and I would argue also to corporate law. But on the flip side, there are many tools within all of our jurisdictions in which securities regulation or corporate law matter, I believe, to what happens in the wider world and in climate in particular. And there are tools that can be quite useful and that maybe actually only exist within securities regulation. So this paper, again, is in the US context. It's up on SSRN if you want to take a look at it. But I do think that securities regulation can be a facilitative mechanism, both with regard to corporate governance itself, but also with regard to dealing with climate externalities. But it can also be an impediment. And obviously in the US context right now, we're seeing how it can possibly be an impediment when these tools and mechanisms are narrowed or limited, particularly with regard to shareholder power. So that's the punchline, and like literally not much else probably will matter, except for I also need to say, come on. Why is it? Oh, there. For the purposes of our discussion, I added on a third question, which is not really in the chapter, again, being focused on the US, but here I want to think about how do these dynamics play out in East Asia. So just very briefly, Again, there's a lot of things that I think I talked about in this forum 2 years ago, just kind of mapping out what are the ways in which climate issues have come into securities law and regulation in many markets. Disclosure obviously is one of them, defining green, defining climate, so taxonomies is another, regulation for market intermediaries, so asset manager requirements, fund level regulation, and then prudential regulation for the banking sector. So those are some obvious ones. All of these are present in our Asian markets, and I think all of you can think of areas in which in your own jurisdiction, if you have looked at this, that these measures exist. So on the right-hand side, some examples, 30 plus countries have now adopted the IFRS sustainability and climate disclosure frameworks, including Hong Kong, where I am, Singapore, mainland Australia. I think South Korea is pending right now, is my understanding. But anyway, these things have been around actually now for a number of years. And so obviously as part of the regulatory landscape. But these have a big effect, or potentially big effect, on what companies themselves, issuers, as well as their investors can do and will be able to do. And this is maybe beyond the scope of what's in the paper, but I do think that we are at the cusp of waiting to see how much new information and the disclosure that is produced will fuel activism in many of our markets around these concerns. Will it, or will it be a nothing? How much will it improve the quality of information in our markets? So these are kind of open questions, but clearly there will be more data out there, there will be more information, and investors may well react to that, markets may well react to that. I'm more interested in the corporate governance effects, but with regard to funds and asset managers, there's also kind of a gatekeeper regulation aspect. So basically in the paper, I look at kind of these dimensions, kind of 4 or 5 dimensions of where capital market regulation may affect corporate governance on the one hand, but also broader climate responses on the other. I think one of the main contributions of the chapter, if you can say that it has a contribution that's new, it is primarily descriptive, but one of the things that I wanted to think about and that I do think is helpful in this project is to just look across markets. So taking the US as a starting point, but in any of our jurisdictions, what are the factors that determine whether law matters? Like, what are the factors that determine whether securities law is a place where we might hope for a useful mechanism to deal with things like climate externalities? And I think there's a couple dimensions that matter in our own system. So number one is the relative preference in our various jurisdictions for a regulatory or top-down approach relative to a market approach. So I think that's kind of obvious. The US obviously favors a market approach and is very skeptical of regulatory top-down approaches. Number two, how much policy support is there in public law more broadly, whether environmental regulation or is there a climate strategy nationally or in that jurisdiction that will back climate action, because that informs the whole thing. Now, obviously in the US, it's been a pendulum swing. So we have Trump 1, we have Biden, we have Trump 2, and now we're completely out of Paris. So support for climate action is at an all-time low, at least at the federal level in the US, but that's not true here in Asia, and we talked about this in the public panel. Number 3, and this is a big issue obviously in the US, is what is the authority of the SEC to even say anything about a topic like climate externalities and climate risk, even if we're talking about disclosure. So again, the nature and the remit of the regulator or the standard setter matters, and there's a literature on this as to whether it's a legislative body, whether it's a regulator or an agency body, or whether it's a market standard setter. So I touch upon that a little bit in the chapter. And then the last piece, which we talked about with regard to boards, but applies also to regulators, is how much space is there within the legislative framework, within the regulatory bounds of that authority for the discretion. And so again, with regard to the SEC, but we could think of other market regulators for whom this matters. So the paper looks across these different tools or mechanisms and then applies these factors to see, how do these factors play out in these different areas. So with regard to disclosure regulation in the US, we have the SEC as the standard setter. We have this backdrop of unstable policy commitment and real legal questions that have never been asked before about the scope of authority of the SEC to do what I think it is designed to do, which is regulate how much information reaches the market, but obviously that is very contested now. But what about Asia? So I want to look again across these different mechanisms in the next 4 slides and look at like, well, what's different in the Asian context, bearing in mind these different factors that determine how much a regulator can do and what difference it might make. So again, if we look at disclosure regulation, I'm just going to take Hong Kong. We've seen a lot of measures come out in the past number of years, particularly last year when the disclosure rules took effect. We're in the process of developing assurance standards in Hong Kong that I think are going to be very impactful. And there's a clear scope of authority. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the SFC are doing this through the listing rules. There's no question been raised, as far as I'm aware, of whether they can do this or not. I think this is true in many of our markets. There's just really no question about the scope of authority of the regulator to do what it does. What we've seen, and I mentioned this a little bit in the public forum, but last December, the exchange puts out what it does every year, which is kind of an annual review of reporting. They're using AI now, so it's a lot faster. You'll be curious to know. But a couple things on kind of ESG and corporate governance that came out of this do suggest that the amendments to the listing rules and the disclosure regulations are having a modest behavioral effect. Number one, I mentioned in the panel earlier, scenario analysis. Apparently 84% of large cap companies are assessing their own resilience and looking at climate scenarios, which I don't think many boards were doing 10 years ago, right? So this is totally driven by compliance measures. ESG, we've got 100% of large cap companies reporting, almost similar percentage for across the entire market of listed companies in Hong Kong, maybe no surprise to many of you. And a really high percentage, I think, also reporting on scope 3. So that's something. If we look at the governance effects of some of these measures, again, flipping back to the US, more to our focus here today, there's been a real attack on the shareholder proposal mechanism. Some of you may have been following these developments, and there was a period where like every week there was some new thing that was happening that was really quite shocking. One of the earlier ones is the change that the SEC took to beneficial owner reporting under 13D and issued an advisory note suggesting that if you make any effort to use your power as an investor to influence the board in any way, then you may be brought within the more onerous reporting requirements because you are going to be deemed to be controlling. So it took a very broad and expansive view that almost knocked out any kind of engagement. And so a lot of the BlackRocks and the other big three were kind of putting their policies on pause for that reason as well. This ties back to some of the concerns that Morley and others have raised just generally about why institutional investors might be passive in the US context. Added onto that is the antitrust concerns that have now been raised for now a couple of years in the literature, but that's been picked up by state governments and the federal government, and there's an antitrust lawsuit now against the big three. I think it was, I can't remember if it was Vanguard or State Street that like a couple weeks ago settled apparently in this litigation, which is really depressing. But again, for acting on ESG considerations, they were, the argument in that case was that you have colluded to repress or suppress coal companies because you have advocated for divestment or you've advocated for other measures that would reduce carbon footprints, and that's designed in a concerted way to impact their business and affect the market. So anyway, that litigation is still ongoing. And then we also have rules that have been interpreted differently in different administrations on whether or not investment fiduciaries can consider ESG factors at all in investment decisions and also engagement. So that's the US Department of Labor rules. So there's all these things that are affecting engagement, activism, shareholder impact on companies that are directly related to what's happening with this capital market regulation space, but are definitely corporate governance effects. But in Asia, again, very differently. So just very quickly, I'm going to run through a couple of things here. Again, just to put up here, we do have almost the opposite rules applying in many of the Asian markets. Those of you from Japan, we talked offline, these have been out there in the Japanese market since I think 2014 or 2012. So they're not new. But these, in fact, require asset managers in Hong Kong and elsewhere here in East Asia to take account of climate risk in investment decisions because it's smart financially, and if you don't do it, you're acting blind. So that's the argument, and that's the understanding here in Asia, and the regulators are pushing that, right? In Hong Kong, there's not much by way of enforcement on this yet, but it is a requirement that it be considered. And here's some details for the Hong Kong Fund Manager Code of Conduct, just to get you a more detailed sense of what's required. So it's actually like a top-down regulatory approach on investment intermediaries. It's TCFD-based. It's got all the frameworks embedded, and it mandates oversight and climate risk management and the use of appropriate tools and metrics, as well as disclosures. So there's a lot of things that are related to internal governance for fund managers that's almost flip opposite of what you see in the US. And then the last dimension that the chapter looks at, because again, looking at what are these mechanisms for securities regulation to have a real world impact on climate externalities? That's the question. So disclosure is one, corporate governance is another, investment intermediary regulation is another, and then backing out to public and private tools behind all of this. Obviously, here in Asia, very different context again from the US, where we have strong pushback in the courts, as I mentioned, the SEC abandoning many of these tools. But even had we been under a Biden administration, even had we seen the climate disclosures go forward, there was a recognition that companies are in a transition. And so that these governance requirements, even some of the reporting requirements, are still new mechanisms or new procedures, and internal work needs to be done by companies to really adjust to this. And as a result, most of the global frameworks have put in private litigation, civil enforcement safe harbors, so that we wouldn't be seeing private litigation for a number of years even, just to give companies a buffer as information quality is improving, and to put some of those internal corporate governance measures in place. So questions for East Asia, what would enforcement look like here, where we are still moving forward in ESG, both as from an issuer perspective, but also for investment intermediaries? I think we can expect safely to say public enforcement to matter more. Again, we see an impact of the geopolitics in this space, the spillover I talked about on the public panel, the Trump effect, the weakening Brussels effect from Europe. And I think we will not, any of us in this room, be expecting a lot by way of private enforcement. But we might be expecting more in terms of disclosure-driven engagement. So I think this is a really neat area for future research here in Asia. For those of us interested, as I know Dan is, interested in everything, but shareholder activism in particular, what will we be able to do with the new data that's coming out? So just briefly, the conclusions of the chapter are, no surprise, securities regulation can support but not displace direct public regulation of climate externalities. And the question of whether securities law matters and whether it is a useful place to look at these solutions will depend on, again, the factors that I mentioned, and really what is the scope of the regulator and their authority. They can, but in places like the US, where things work very differently, we're seeing already, of course, barriers for corporate governance mechanisms to play a role, for market mechanisms to play a role, and I obviously don't think that's a great thing. Therefore, I think East Asia offers us, again, some positive counterexamples and a different story and a different account of how stronger capital market regulation can really encourage better corporate governance and also facilitate better investor-driven and market-driven climate responses. So again, not a whole lot new here, but this is what the chapter is about. And I think the volume itself is really neat for those of you that are more broadly interested in private law questions. It's a really great group of contributors. I encourage you to take a look at the volume when it comes out. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Virginia. So the commentator for this session is Assistant Professor Xingguang from the School of Law, Peking University. Please welcome.
Thanks for Virginia's insightful presentation of her article, and I really appreciate this opportunity to comment on it. Strictly speaking, what I'm presenting today is not so much a commentary, and since it is already a well-developed article, and my and it shows us a whole picture of how securities regulation can play a role in promoting ESG and sustainability goals. So my remarks are more like a discussion, and since my primary research interest lies in investment fund and investment fund regulation, so I will approach this article primarily from the fund perspective. Okay, so according to Virginia's article, both institutional shareholders' engagement and ESG integrated investment strategy are two essential matters that deserve attention from securities regulation. And these two are exactly the two paths toward ESG goals by mutual funds. And for these two paths or these two mechanisms, my preliminary view is that only the first is practically viable, but even for the first channel, the first mechanism, it carries a high degree of a high risk of greenwashing. I will briefly explain why, and I also look forward to hear about Virginia's view on the practical viability of these two channels. Okay, let me start with the first mechanism, the ESG-related selection strategy. This means that the funds adopted an ESG-related or ESG-oriented strategy. They select the companies in their for their portfolio which have a better ESG performance. But for this kind of firms or ESG labeled firms, they always include a ESG or ESG related term or label in their name. But the difficulty or the problem is that to what degree these ESG firms will incorporate or the ESG consideration into their investment strategy can vary enormously across the different firms. So there would be a situation where a fund may have a green word in their fund name, but they only put a 20% weight on the green element, or they can also only apply the green strategy on a small portion of the fund assets, like a 10%. So this kind of situation can result in a high risk of greenwashing or misleading effect. So from a regulatory perspective, a very natural and direct response would be establish a well-designed fund naming rules that would be like, if you have a green word in your fund name, you have to apply this strategy or apply the green strategy on at least 80% of your fund assets. But this immediately raises another question that, okay, if you apply the green strategy on 80% of a fund assets, according to your strategy, there's only the green element or the green consideration only account for 20% weight or at even a lower rate. And what makes this the case even more complicated is that even you allocate the green strategy apply this green strategy on 80% of your fund assets, and also the weight of green consideration is also above 80%. But how do you define green? Is also the degree of green can also vary a lot across different funds. So while we admit fund naming rules, as the article also suggested, is an effective way to encounter the risk of greenwashing, but in practice it will be extremely difficult to formulate or enforce such rules. And at the same time, if we design the naming rules very concrete or even specified everything for the fund naming, it will come at the cost of product diversity. Because some found they want just to pursue a mixed or a gradual strategy of ESG promotion. So for these reasons, it seems to me that the naming rules, while necessary, cannot fully eliminate the inherent risk of greenwashing in the ESG investment products. But on the other hand, in the extreme case, if such fund naming rules are totally non-existent, there would definitely be severe greenwashing, and this can be evidenced by the situation in China. For example, if we look at the data of the holdings of the ESG funds in China, we will be very shocked by what is the top first holding in the portfolio of ESG funds. This is the data of the 2021. If you look at the first quarter of 2021, the top first holding is Maotai. Maotai is a very famous, or the most famous liquor company in China. And while the liquor company is obviously against the society element under the ESG label, because it's bad for our health, and it also against the environment element under the ESG, because it's very water consuming. And if we look at the data of 2024, the fourth quarter, it's also the highest. It also accounts for the highest allocation in ESG strategy funds. And this is the whole trajectory of the ranking in ESG fund holdings of Maotai. You can see in the whole year, it's ranked in the top holdings. Okay, so this case can vividly reflect the status quo and the real risk of greenwashing in China's ESG fund market. So we quickly move on to the second mechanism of how mutual funds or fund managers can promote ESG goals, and are even more pessimistic to the viability of this mechanism, because it seems that the regulation cannot address the inherent weakness of this mechanism. And this inherent weakness I think is primarily caused by two incentive mismatch problems. The first mismatch is the incentive mismatch is that many funds, or a large portion of funds, are passive funds. A passive fund, they charge a very low management fee, so it makes that the fund managers cannot afford the cost for the costly ESG engagement. So for them, but such passive funds in many markets, they account for nearly half of the mutual fund market. So this is the first incentive mismatch problem. And and also this mismatch is exacerbated by the free rider issue. That means if you engage in the ESG matters of your portfolio companies, the benefit from such ESG engagement is shared by all your competing managers. But the cost is borne by those actively engaged in the ESG governance issues. So this also discourages the fund managers to actively play a role in ESG issues. And the second incentive mismatch problem is that for the evaluation of the fund managers is always based on near-term performance. But the benefit, and especially the uncertain benefit from the ESG engagement will realize in the very long term. So this mismatch will also discourage them from engagement. So thus the fund managers may have very little incentive to actively play a role in ESG engagement. So the most cost-effective way for them to vote is to vote in a pro-management manner. And such low incentive, in theory, are also supported by empirical evidence. We can see the retreat of top U.S. Fund managers on ENS proposals. We can see a very obvious decreasing trend of the U.S. Top fund managers supporting rate on the environmental and social shareholder proposals or resolutions. Okay, I will quickly finish. So the last question would be, okay, we have seen the low incentive both theoretically and empirically of the fund managers to promote ESG goals. So can we design an ESG-based or ESG-linked remuneration structure to address this low incentive problem? The answer would be to aspect first, even we have seen that the ESG-linked or ESG-based compensation has been widely accepted or a practice in executive compensation, but we have seen no practice in the mutual fund management fee structure. And secondly, even we look at the executive compensation, the findings of existing study are not very promising. So that means such remuneration structure generated very limited genuine incentives and behavior change. And there were two main problems or main flaws. The first is as this study shows, among all the ESG metrics, among all the executive compensation metrics, only a very small portion of them are binding ESG metrics. Binding means they're very quantitative and it's easily for the outsiders to review. And most other ESG metrics are subjective, discretionary, and it's very hard for the outsiders to review. And it's the second flaw in practice is the achievement gap, which means they always set the bar very low. As this study indicates, they compared the ESG target with the financial target. They find that 44% of the firms in the sample, they made or exceeded all the financial targets, and 22% of them missed all the financial target. In contrast, 67% of the firms made or exceeded all the ESG targets, and only 2% of them missed all of them. Okay, so this is my comment. Thank you.